right, we are going live. I gotta change this. All right, we are going live. Good stuff. All right, there we go. Got stream elements going. It's all up and set. All right, here we go. Well, hello everyone. I'm looking forward to having this conversation tonight, and we're going to go ahead and start by talking a little bit about the software developer compensation. Now, let me go ahead and toggle over to a little tweet. Well, I guess I'll go ahead and skip it for now. So one of the things that inspired this conversation here is we went ahead. My voice is a little low. All right. Let me go ahead and do a little bit of gain on that. Okay. How's that? Is that better? Okay. Still too low? Okay. Looks like that's good. All right. So let me start over here. So one of the things that inspired me to want to talk about this conversation is we just recently had we went ahead and put out a job on Upwork to go ahead and try to hire some developers to go ahead and work on a small line of business application for us. It was basically intended to kind of build a little KPI system for us to kind of measure how our marketing and product and sales sort of performance all kind of correlate together over a long period of time. Now, it's not something that we've had a lot of experience doing historically. We've had some rough KPIs that we follow, such as the size of our mailing list, but that's really kind of about it. So this is not a super high value project for us. We're not trying to go ahead and launch the next big e-commerce sensation or something like that. This is like an internal line of business application. In fact, the way we spec'd it, this application doesn't even have a front end. It was just supposed to go ahead and produce time series data that would be read into Grafana and used to go ahead and let our marketing people go ahead. My music volume's got to be turned down. Okay, let's do that. All right. And then let me go ahead, try adjusting my gain here. Nope, that all looks good. Okay, all right, sorry about that, I had to turn the music down. Long story short, we got some crazy ass submissions back for this project that we're working on. And I wanted to go ahead and actually have a little conversation about software developer compensation because we got offers back for like $120 an hour to go ahead and work on something that probably shouldn't cost more than like $4,000 or $5,000 to go ahead and build. I eventually ended up taking the Upwork listing down. It was actually our screw up to some extent. We should have priced the job differently. We should have probably done it at a fixed price. We would have gotten the types of offers we wanted. But the submissions we were getting were completely devoid from any sort of reality here. So I wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit about developer compensation in the context of why let's say I basically work both sides of the table here. Our company, Petabridge, is in the business of selling support, training, consulting to fairly large customers. We have a lot of customers in spaces like wealth management, banking, doing automated clearinghouse type stuff, insurance, medicine, transportation, logistics, that type of thing. So we sell them consulting and support services. And then we, in turn, I have a team of developers who work with us, and I'm always looking to try to find a good hire if I can. But this most recent experience made me think that a lot of what happens, particularly on an open market like Upwork, is basically just bulk applying. And I had to go ahead and, I kind of anticipate that to some extent, but some of the offers that were made to me off of Upwork were definitely way out of line with what the value of this particular service is going to be. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, from both sides of the table, why do employers reject offers? So if you want to go ahead and try to maximize your compensation, what do you have to do to go ahead and do that? And the answer is you really need to think about reducing your counterparty risk. So counterparty risk is a finance term. It happens in trading, banking, all sorts of different industries, but it's a generic term for what is the risk of the other party on the other side of the table completely failing to hold up their end of a contract. And this represents typically a fairly catastrophic failure. So for an employer, the big risk that we have here is that in the event that a developer we hire costs a lot of money up front and basically promises us the moon, but ends up ultimately completely shitting the bed, we're going to end up having to go ahead and redo all that work. We're going to lose all the time, and we're going to lose the upfront development costs. So coming in with a really high offer is really going to go ahead and essentially introduce a high propensity for counterparty risk without doing some things to help reduce that risk, which is what we're going to talk about next. Finally, I'm going to spend a little bit of time of if you want to go ahead and try to command a higher level of compensation, what do you have to do to do that? What are some of the things you can do to go ahead and try to improve your bona fides and also reduce your risk while you're at it? So let's go ahead and start with the first little bit. Why do employers reject offers? So the difference between, let's say, a lot of stakeholders inside a company that are trying to hire developers is that these people typically own either products or business units or development teams. And ideally, these people are very mindful of risk and uncertainty. Developers like to talk about you're living in a world with no delivery timelines and all that stuff. And let me just say that's a fantasy. The way the real world works is customers need to be able to be given expectations that they can go ahead and plan around. Therefore, deadlines are real, and most businesses are going to have them. If you're in an environment where you don't have them, good for you. That's great. But risk is something that employers have to be mindful of, and they have to find a way to meet those expectations, deadlines. They have to find a way to stay inside budget. And so those are the parameters that shape the decision making that an employer is going to engage in. So I take a look at, by the way, this applies just as much for full-time hiring as it does for contracting. I take a look at my input costs when I'm thinking about hiring somebody. The first is their compensation. What is the dollar amount I have to pay this person? And by that compensation, also includes some things that are not compensation, such as if I'm hiring a full-time person, I also have payroll taxes on top of that. I have benefits. I have, let's say, licenses and seats I have to buy for that person that basically allow them to be productive inside our company. So there's a compensation. I'm kind of just lumping that all together into one figure right here, but that's like the total cost of ownership of having one person in that chair, given what their offer is on salary and everything else. And the second input cost, and this often gets overlooked, is management overhead. What does it cost to manage this person and help them succeed in their goals? So ideally, an expensive senior developer should require very little management overhead. It's not their first rodeo. They kind of know how to navigate complex pieces of software. They know what questions to ask. They know how to keep meetings short. They don't need a lot of training, that type of stuff. So someone who's more expensive should have an inversely correlated degree of management overhead. Now here's the nasty part, which is counterparty risks. The number one reason why people don't get hired usually isn't compensation, like asking for too much money. It's usually that they didn't do enough to reduce their perceived counterparty risk. So The two big areas in counterparty risk are basically dealing with errors. So the criticality of errors. This means if you screw up, how severe of a screw up is it? One of the famous sayings, I think it's from Andy Grove, one of the founders of Intel, is keep your mistakes small. That applies to individual software developers as well. Breaking the build and having the CI system not be able to deploy, not the end of the world. That's probably all right. You're going to get away with that. Successfully rolling out an update to production that completely annihilates the e-commerce system and creates an actual live business stoppage that impacts users, you've created a massive liability for your employer when you do that. Developers who are typically really, really good at their job, and every now and then in their career they make one giant error, you're probably going to be all right. That's probably going to be okay. They're probably going to end up saying, okay, this is someone who's done a lot of great work for us over the years, doesn't make mistakes very often, but this one time there was a weakness in our business process around how we do deployments that allow this to happen. We're going to go ahead and have that developer work with our DevOps team to improve it, and we'll get around it. So even making a critical mistake every now and then is not the end of the world. However, developers who frequently make critical mistakes need to be fired. They have to be thrown out of the organization because you can't trust the quality of what they do. There's something deficient in the way they are doing their job. So people who tend to go ahead and make, let's say, like pretty frequent big mistakes are going to be shown the door, and they should be shown the door. It's the right thing for the employer to do. And this brings us to the last bit down here, which is the do-over cost. If I bring someone in off the street to do some work for us, and they are a screw-up, or they're not able to deliver it, or there's some other, let's say, failure risk involved, maybe they lied on their resume and they actually don't know how to do it, they said they did, we have to fire that person. We have to go ahead and do it over, and that's going to go ahead and cause us to go and retask a bunch of other resources. We're probably going to have to throw their code away. We're going to lose a lot of time, and this might destroy our budget and deadline expectations we've set with people. That's a gigantic failure. And this is what employers really want to avoid, is having to do do-over cost, because it would be cheaper for us just to build it ourselves in the first place with the resources we already have than hire someone else to go and do this. So that's what employers like me are really mindful of, is all of these inputs and their risks. This is like the cost column right here. Now on the output side, in terms of how we assess risk, we have to take a look at the rewards. What's the present value of the software output? So if a developer successfully does their job, and let's say the quality of work isn't necessarily superb, but it meets the goals. What's the present value of this software? What business value measured in dollars is it going to produce today? Next, we have the future value of the software output. It's a good example. If I hire a developer to go ahead and build, let's say, a totally new product for us that we've never put in front of a customer before, the present value of that software output is probably going to be pretty low, because there's a lot of uncertainty around the market, and none of that is inside the developer's control. So the factor I'm going to go ahead and adjust in my mental formula for hire or no hire here, I'm going to go ahead and adjust the future value of that software output, which is, we've done our market research. We have a rough idea of how big this market's going to be. We have a rough idea of what it's going to cost to go ahead and adopt customers to use this platform. We know there's going to be a lot of stuff we don't know about how well this is going to perform once it first gets introduced to the market, but we're going to do our best, right? So that's going to be one of the things we're going to go ahead and try to address as part of this. Finally, there's also the benefit of skill development for the software developer. The idea being that the person who is working with us and is learning how our architecture works, how our domain works, and how some of our other processes and tools work, that person's going to require lower training overhead and lower management overhead next time, because they're going to be more familiar with the environment. So developers are going to be expected to essentially have higher levels of output the longer they're in the organization. And the higher level output basically comes from the fact that their management costs should go down, and the actual delivery time of how quickly they can deliver a solution should basically also decrease, which means their input costs are shrinking. That's why their output's going up. They're getting more done for less. So these are examples of both like short-term and long-term sort of gains that we're expecting to get from any individual hiring decision. So the formula that I've basically put together for this, and by the way, I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a scientist, so I'll probably get laughed at for this. But this is my this is my risk-reward ratio that I do in my head for whether or not any individual hiring decision is worthwhile. So on the top are our outputs, on the bottom are our inputs. And so what I'm looking for is I want to have an H value that is greater than 1. This means that I think my reward will be greater than my risk and my costs. So just to recap, my input costs are compensation plus management overhead plus the criticality of errors times their frequency plus the do-over cost. So so where you're probably going to get a no hire decision almost always isn't going to be your compensation. It's going to be these other factors on the right. If I'm very convinced that you don't require much management overhead and your likelihood of producing a total disaster that has to be redone by our team is fairly low, I'm probably going to be happier paying you more than taking a total risk on somebody who is not a proven quantity in my eyes here. So essentially the area we want to really go ahead and try to work on for our purposes of this conversation tonight is reducing these factors. That's what you want to work on. That way you can keep this factor nice and high, and that's what you want. That's what matters to you as a developer. Now, on the output side, you basically don't really have a lot of control over as a developer over what the present value of the software is. The only way you can really affect that is by, from an architectural point of view, being able to go ahead and make sure you deliver a solution to market relatively quickly that has the ability to be changed rapidly on the fly. By doing that, you can actually go ahead and improve the both current value and the future value of that system as iteration cost becomes cheaper and it becomes easier to go ahead and deploy the next version of the software. So that's something else you can go ahead and do. Plus, skilling up is always good. You can always go ahead and do that. So this is the risk formula. And like I said, where developers usually don't get the hire decision from me is that they come in with a high asking price, wanting 100 plus bucks an hour, and they've done nothing to reduce risk. So I take a look at it and I just immediately throw those in the discard pile, where it's like, this looks like a great way for me to burn a pile of cash really fast. So like I said, when you do things to reduce risk, I'm totally open to it. I'm open to going and working with people I trust. I'm working with people who build a credible case why they should be paid what they're paid. But if you don't do anything to reduce risk, you can't make that case. Next reason why I don't hire. When I put a job description or let's say a job up on Upwork or whatever, if you bulk apply to it or an agency applied on your behalf, that goes in the discard pile immediately. Because it means the data I'm getting back from you, from our screening questions and everything else that we intentionally put there to try to learn more about our applicants, it means that data is worthless. So I am getting I'm getting all noise and no signal. So that's the first reason why I'd probably go ahead and throw a lot of that data out. The other reason is someone who's going to go ahead and just blow through job applications without necessarily stopping to go ahead and ask questions or be curious about what we're doing or really read the prompts, that tends to indicate this person's going to require a lot of management overhead. I'm going to have to spend a lot of time drafting specifications. They're going to have to be more detailed than they would be for maybe someone who might be a little bit more experienced. I'm going to have to spend a lot of time reviewing the quality of their work. And by the way, the worst thing you can do for me specifically is drive up my management costs. I'm spread pretty thin on all the things we have to do at our business all the time anyway. The last thing I want to do is hire somebody, start paying them a bunch of money, and then also have to spend a lot of time managing and training them too. There has to be a cap on how much of that gets spent in order for us to realize some value out of each individual person we hire. Now, next thing, did not or allay or reduce failure risk. So didn't do anything to go ahead and make me feel like this person could successfully deliver the product. So even for a cheap developer, like we got some offers, like I mentioned, we got some that were in the $120 range. Well, we got some that were in the $10 range too. I ultimately didn't hire anybody for this project because I didn't get the impression that the failure risk was low for anybody in there. Now I actually got a couple offers. I should point out. I actually did get a couple offers from people I found to be very credible. They're a little bit out of my price range. It's no fault of their own. It just wasn't the right fit for this job. They're someone I'd probably want to bring in on a much more mission critical project that's a lot more valuable. On a back end job like this, what I really should have done is I should have set a fixed price and kind of said, all right, anyone who can do it for this much. That would have been a better way of doing it. But because I wasn't sure what the actual total development cost was, I wasn't 100% clear on that. Okay. So let me go ahead, get rid of that. Okay. So next thing I wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit about here is, let's see. Oh yeah. Time lost and do-over costs are too high. So this is the worst thing you can do to go ahead and try and apply for a job is not send signals to me that make me think that, how do I put this? Make me believe I'm not going to have to haul one of my own software developers off of something they're doing and make them redo this job. That's really what I really want to be convinced. I can't tell you the number of projects I've been in where I spent a lot of money on somebody who had very impressive bona fides, but ultimately wasn't able to cut the mustard, and I ended up having to either work late and make back the money I personally lost, and also still do the work myself. This is ultimately what I really want to avoid, and that's the biggest reason why I didn't really hire anybody, is I didn't get people who I felt could do the job were too expensive, given what the job's value was. The people who were bidding at sort of the right price range didn't really allay or reduce failure risk. So let's go ahead and talk about what we can do to reduce the employer's counterparty risk. If you want to get the job offers, you want to go ahead and get the maximum possible compensation, this is what you have to focus on. So the first thing you should do to reduce your risk is screen for jobs you actually want to do. Don't bulk apply for stuff. Go ahead and be selective and look at jobs that are either going to help you upskill, meaning they take something you're already interested in doing and are already passionate about, and will help you go deeper on it than you are right now. That's a great type of job to look for. And go ahead and assume when you interact with, let's say, the job listing on Upwork, or maybe you're applying for a full-time job through a site like Indeed or something like that, go ahead and assume that your comments will eventually make their way to someone with detailed domain knowledge. Now, even if, let's say, there's a technical recruiter sitting between you and the hiring manager, I guarantee you, if you ask some thoughtful questions and say, hey, have you considered doing this? Or I've worked on this type of system before, and I'm really passionate about solving some of these problems. You don't have to write, an essay on this stuff. But sending a signal that you are someone who's got a special interest in this particular position or this project will very quickly separate you from the rest of the pack. That's a very helpful thing you can do. You'll also spend a lot less time churning through potential jobs, by the way. I would say focus on the ones you think you will be successful at doing and the ones you actually really want to do for the sake of, let's say, the job's details itself. Now, I know there's a lot of jobs out there that you might do just because it pays well, and you just kind of need the cash. That's fine too. In that case, I would recommend sticking to jobs where you have sufficient domain expertise to deliver a solution quickly. This is another way of reducing your risk. So I'll give you an example. We hired a developer on Upwork maybe might have been 2 or 3 years ago. It was a DevOps developer who was really specialized on technologies that I don't know anything about, like Puppet and Salt and Terraform. And we needed someone who could go ahead and basically help us programmatically synthesize new Team City build agent images on Windows Azure. Because we were running into problems with all the new versions of .NET Core coming out, where those images were frequently out of date or broken by underlying changes to the way the VM runtime worked and yada, yada, yada. So I found a developer who was very skilled at doing all those things, and he was from Russia, and he was, I would say, for the Russian market, relatively expensive. But he was able to knock out a great solution, ask really good questions very quickly. I got a great signal that this guy would be someone who could turn this project around in a very low risk and quick way for us. And it's because, this probably wasn't the most interesting job in the world for him, but he was able to go ahead and basically say, I've been doing this for 5 years. I know the ins and outs of these technologies. I use them every day for work. I'm just hoping to make a little bit of money on the side here. And so he got the job. I actually ended up using him twice for 2 jobs. Now, we actually use Azure pipelines now, so I haven't needed to use that script he wrote in quite a while, but solved a great problem for us and was well worth the money. So by sticking with sort of exactly what your wheelhouse is and being very level-headed about what you promise, I promise that'll go a lot further, because ultimately the hiring manager is going to be able to see if you're bullshitting them or not. So I would strongly recommend don't overpromise on anything you do to go ahead and when you communicate with a potential hirer. Next, like I mentioned here, stick to your strengths in your resume and profile. Don't list every technology you've ever worked with, because it becomes impossible for me to sort out what you're actually good at. So for instance, I've been, over the course of my career, I've done a lot of work with ASP.NET MVC. I did a lot of work with Apache Cassandra. I did a lot of work with C++. I've done work with Visual Basic and ASP, the ASP MVC and ASP Classic. I don't list most of that stuff in my resume because for the past 5 or 6 years, I've touched relatively little of that. And so I don't want to, mislead someone who might come and hire us by saying, oh yeah, I'm an ASP.NET Core developer, even though all I've really used it for is building a couple demo applications. I don't really have that deep domain knowledge to be able to claim that. And also, this is doubly true. Back, 7 years ago, I could definitely claim that I, was a fairly robust front-end developer. My front-end skills are totally atrophied. I haven't learned anything new since Knockout.js in that department. I would never put that in my resume. So what I would put is what I'm good at. I'm really good at Akka.NET. I'm good at dealing with concurrency problems. I'm really good at dealing with sockets. I know how to work with all sorts of high-performance sort of C# constructs, and I'm pretty good at project management, architecture, and that type of thing. So sticking to your strengths in your resume and your profile will ultimately help give a clearer signal to developers of where do you fit in the organization. Because not everybody, some developers, some organizations want, a one-size-fits-all developer who can be a Swiss Army knife and fit into lots of different positions. But some companies are looking for developers who are going to fit into a very sort of specific skilled position. So I would recommend playing to your strengths. Now, if you do a lot of work in front-end and ASP.NET and SignalR, and you're doing, let's say, Azure stuff behind the scenes, then you should definitely list all that. But I see resumes where people are listing, Magento, Perl, Python, Ruby, blah, blah, blah. And it's these are all completely different, these are all completely different stacks. I don't believe you when you say that you have, let's say, production level qualifications in all these. Just because you used Ruby on a project 4 years ago doesn't mean you're still current with it. So stick to your strengths in your resume and your profile. I guarantee you that'll help you stand out more. And by the way, when you actually get put through a technical screen, you'll be much better prepared to sail through that successfully, as long as you've been very clear about where your strengths are in your profile. Now, the next things you can do to reduce your risk. Before you even get to the job application stage, this is something you should be constantly working on in terms of investing in yourself. So a piece of advice I've been giving to some developers who basically have entered software as kind of like a second career, so they didn't get a degree in it. And by the way, most software developers don't have one, so don't even worry about that. Most of them, if they do have a college degree, is usually in something else. My younger brother is a fantastic, very skilled programmer. He has a history degree, so don't worry about not having a computer science degree. No one cares. What you should worry about is your proof of work, your ability to demonstrate competency in the areas you've chosen. So I sincerely believe the best way of doing this is to maintain an active GitHub profile. There's no better substitute than this. I can see what types of things you're interested in as an employer. I can see what sorts of things you contribute, what types of work you do. I can go ahead and see, whether or not you're able to go ahead and contribute to someone else's project or maintain your own. You don't have to, create a project that has several thousand stars on GitHub to be able to make a really impressive GitHub profile. All you have to do is just consistently show up, demonstrate what you are good at and what you're passionate about. And you don't necessarily have to write a commit every day or anything like that. But just having some body of work that a developer can take a look at and something that you actually include as part of your resume, I promise will definitely help separate you from the pack. Now, one problem that does come up for a lot of corporate developers, these are people who, already have a job, and they're working usually for a large company that that exercises a lot of control over what they are able to do with the code they write. One of the things that is difficult about that is it's actually a lot harder to prove your work because you might have a family, you may not have all that time to go ahead and maintain an active GitHub profile. Happens. Or the actual work you spend your day job doing, you don't really have any easy way of proving that you even did it, because it's all hidden behind a corporate firewall somewhere, or you're under an NDA or whatever. The next best thing I can recommend that you try to do is, to the best of your ability, try to write case studies or postmortems about some of the problems you ran into. Now you can anonymize some of the details if you wish, or blog about it years later, and go ahead and try to put this up on your blog. But what this demonstrates is really valuable experience of things you've actually learned by being proven in the field. And this will carry you a lot further than, let's say, just linking to a website that you built. I've had people link me to websites that I know, a major firm like Accenture built, and Accenture is not in their, bio at all. So I know that's bullshit when I'm looking at it. So the linking to websites you've built, I understand the attraction there as a proof of work. Only do that if you can prove that you did it. So ways you can prove that you did it would be having some sort of, let's say, comment in some of the JavaScript files that are up on the site on your front end. That'd be one way of doing it. If it's a website you fully own and operate, go ahead and list yourself on the team page. You have full control over it, so go ahead and do that. Or the other way you could potentially do it is introduce, if you get this far in the hiring process, go ahead and introduce the people you built the site for to your prospective hirer. This is more appropriate for things like Upwork, for instance, where you're actually trying to apply for like a contracting job. But I've had people lie about all sorts of crap on their resumes before, including their level of education, including their past compensation, and things that were fairly easy to go ahead and verify. So people will lie about incredible stuff. And as a result, this linking to websites they built signal I find is fairly weak compared to these other ones, because I can't necessarily correlate your identity with what I'm seeing on the browser. Not to mention, if it's a big enough system, I have no idea what your hand in it was. Maybe you were the official emoji artist for this website or something. I have no idea. So I would be a little cautious about recommending that. You're better off, in this case, if you worked on, let's say, a really big software project, you might be better off going down the proof of knowledge route. Maintain a blog or a YouTube channel and talk a bit about what your experience has been on some of these big projects. So go ahead and talk a bit about what you learned while you're working on that website, or talk a bit about things you learned not to do, or maybe you compared multiple frameworks or multiple databases to each other as part of like an evaluation process for deciding what you're going to use in a new project there. All that experience is really helpful and demonstrates a degree of, let's say, thoughtfulness that helps reduce risk. It helps sort of establish your ability to reason about trade-offs, which is something that very few developers, in my experience, do very well. So being able to go ahead and basically even have that conversation with yourself on a YouTube channel or on a blog helps demonstrate a level of, let's say, reasoning and a curiosity about what you're working on that'll help reduce your risk profile. Being active on technical social media, I think, is another good one. So obviously, I've got a brand new Twitch stream here with open source production values. We're going to work on improving that. But being active on technical social media is another good way to kind of go ahead and establish your knowledge. One thing I've recently seen a lot of people doing on .NET Twitter, for instance, is a number of different developers tweeting out little images showing like a C# blurb and then showing some performance numbers demonstrating that this was more performant than that, etc. So that's also pretty useful. Being able to go ahead and do some of that behind the scenes, that helps demonstrate that that you've got basically a grasp on what's going on inside your ecosystem and work you're trying to do. However, proof of knowledge is a much weaker way of de-risking than proof of work is. So being able to show something you've done is always more convincing than talking about what you did. So that's why I strongly urge people to work on proof of work, and I particularly urge it for people who are early in their careers. So building up a really nice GitHub profile where you demonstrate sort of where your interests are and what you're learning how to do, I think will get you a lot further than maintaining, let's say, an active Twitter account will necessarily. Although you can do both. I personally, from my point of view, I maintain Petabridge's YouTube channel. I'm about to launch a personal one for myself. I maintain the Petabridge blog and my personal one, and I'm also pretty active on technical social media. But I also, my body of work is overwhelmingly, it's all out on GitHub. One of the other ways, I guess you could do proof of knowledge is also appearing on other people's podcasts and tech conferences, that sort of thing. But if you're not someone who's all that comfortable getting in front of a crowd, that might be a little intimidating. So you might be better off using a long form medium like a blog, for instance. That might be a better way to go. Now, the last thing you can do to try to go ahead and reduce your counterparty risk to an employer is social proof. And social proof, by the way, will get you pretty far. This is otherwise known as going through the back door for a job rather than going through the front door. So one thing you can do to offer some social proof, so if you have to go through the front door, one thing you can do is offer, excuse me, one thing you can do is offer what's called a blind referral. This means there's a mechanism by which you can do this on LinkedIn. I don't remember how to do it, but long story short, you can allow me to go ahead and look through your contacts on LinkedIn, find other people who worked at places you worked, and I can go ahead and I get to pick who I contact to those organizations to ask about whether they would positively or negatively refer you or not. That's much more powerful than you giving me people I can talk to, because I know you've pre-screened people that are going to give you a good referral. Finding someone randomly in a previous company you worked with who gives me a good referral says, okay, this developer must have been pretty good at what they did. All right, perfect. That's fantastic. However, the strongest way to leverage social proof is applying for jobs through your friends and colleagues. At my last company before Petabridge, my absolute two best hires were, actually my three best hires, were all engineers who had worked with someone else who I trusted. And so I ended up with, let's say, a very capable cloud architect. I ended up with a really good front-end developer and a really good back-end developer out of that. So applying for jobs through your friends and colleagues will get you really far. Now, if you're asking yourself, it's like, well, I'm just getting started, I'm relatively new, or maybe I don't have a lot of colleagues in my industry for whatever reason. What can I do to go ahead and get some? This is a great argument for getting involved with your local meetup groups for whatever technology you're interested in, whether it's .NET or Unity 3D or Python or whatever. That's a good way to go ahead and meet other people who are similarly passionate and are in your area and might know other folks who are hiring. And by the way, show up at those meetings, not necessarily just for networking, but because you actually want to learn what other people are talking about there. I had a chance to do this in Los Angeles when I used to live there and when I was in my early 20s. And it was completely life-changing for me. I ultimately ended up meeting all the people who would help me raise money for my first company and would ultimately come to work for me. So I can't recommend strongly enough trying to go ahead and build a social network of people who can recognize your value. And if you're early in your career, the best thing you can do to improve your value is to go ahead and be curious and to take some risks and try to go ahead, oops, hit the wrong button. Try to go ahead and improve your bona fides. So this is where the whole area of like skill development really kind of comes into play here. I find overwhelmingly that most, let's say, technical YouTube channels or people who kind of talk about coaching and getting interviews for technical jobs, they tend to really heavily emphasize the technical stuff. Now, my take is a little different. I think that it is always very useful to learn new programming skills, to go ahead and build up your muscle in terms of being able to manage issues and do triage on, let's say, like an open source project, for instance. But the really valuable skills, I'm going to go ahead and grab a little highlighter here. The really valuable skills are technical risk management, writing, being able to communicate with non-technical stakeholders. Actually, you know what? It's really all the non-technical ones. These ones and these ones are the ones that I believe are the most valuable. Now, why do I say that? Well, we've talked about in this conversation from a hiring point of view, lowering risk is where we want to go. We want to go ahead and try to reduce our prospective employers' fear that they might have to do over our work. That's what we're trying to avoid. So, how can we strengthen our background and be someone who can confidently communicate with them in a way that'll help them reduce their perceived risk, particularly if we're applying for a job through the front door? Well, technical risk management is one of the strongest things you can bone up on in order to do that. I would recommend doing this 1,000,000 times over learning a new programming language. And here's why. Technical risk management is all about reasoning about trade-offs in a technical context. And these come up in these technical risks show up in lots of different ways. So I'll go ahead and give you an example that I was just dealing with today, in fact. So one technical risk we're evaluating on Akka.net, which is my open source project that I maintain, is we're looking at updating our serialization format for how we persist certain types of data objects. And we're doing this in order to actually reduce future technical risk. But introducing that change might potentially increase current technical risk for our users, because by changing that persistence format, I might actually make it impossible for any other old data to get read, which would be one of those critical, catastrophic business failures that we're trying to avoid. So, being able to spot those and reason about the trade-offs and explain clearly what they are, particularly to someone who's, let's say, a product owner or a development manager, will make you immensely valuable inside the organization, because they're ultimately going to ask you for a recommendation on what to do, but making them aware of where the risk is an extremely valuable signal to those people. So being able to spot those on your own and being able to know how to reason about those trade-offs will make you someone who can basically quickly rise up to the level of like a trusted advisor inside your development group. So that's a really robust skill to go ahead and develop. Even though it's not as sexy as learning, I don't know, React or whatever, learning how to navigate around those questions and how to have that conversation, particularly with someone who's a non-technical stakeholder. This will propel you very far into your career if you kind of develop that muscle to go ahead and do that. This is kind of more like an architectural skill rather than necessarily a programming and doing code type skill. But you can do this even on fairly small projects. You can go ahead and say, okay, well, if I program this way, this might consume a lot more memory, but it'll be a lot faster. Or I can go ahead and design it this way, which will go ahead and use a lot less memory, but it's going to use a lot more cycles to do it. That's not necessarily a risk, but it is a trade-off. So learning how to spot technical risks and talk about those is useful, and you can only do that, by the way, by getting engaged in big enough projects where users are going to assume some risk as a result of adopting new changes. Learning how to read others' code. This helps reduce your management overhead, and that's why it's useful. So developers, I find, are typically better and prefer to write new code versus reading old code. And by the way, that is true even for very experienced software developers. Now, what problem does that create? Well, it means that let's be totally frank, most projects are severely underdocumented. And by the way, most developers, even if there is documentation, won't read it from my experience. So most developers kind of prefer to reason about a code base, particularly a legacy one, by trial and error or using IntelliSense if you're in Visual Studio and that type of thing. Learning how to follow the thread of code that someone else wrote, being able to understand what the intent of the previous developer was, and being able to, in your head, fit all these pieces together to kind of understand what the system does today, and being able to do that before you modify it. That will make you someone who does not require a huge amount of management overhead if you do that enough times. You'll be able to be someone who can kind of intuitively reason your way about systems. You can basically take a whole bunch of code, and maybe after a week or two, you'll be able to go ahead and draw some flow charts that basically describe here's how the system somewhat functions today. And so that's a really useful skill to go ahead and develop as well. This will go ahead and, like I said, help reduce your management overhead. Next, on the non-technical side, why would I bother mentioning this on a technical podcast or technical Twitch stream? Well, these non-technical skills like writing and being able to communicate with non-technical stakeholders help communicate what you do and don't understand about the domain and about where the risks might be in the system. Being able to engage in those conversations will separate you from the pack. Most developers, in my opinion, are people who want to have a fairly large amount of structure around a job. They just want to be given a spec they can go and implement without talking to anybody, and they kind of will blindly follow the rules and try to implement whatever they're going to do. That's by and large the way most software developers are, in my limited experience. Well, albeit limited, but still, pretty wide experience, I guess. A developer who takes the time to pause and say, well, if your business is trying to accomplish this, why are you doing it this way? And that's the reasoning about business domains part down here. And that's someone who can maybe help the business stakeholders and the other people who control a lot of the, let's say the budget and the product management and that type of thing. You can help use that to go ahead and sell them on your ability to go ahead and be a real partner in the development of this project. Because you're actually trying to learn, why am I coding this stuff? Not what to code, but what is the code doing and what's the business value it's trying to generate. This will help you go ahead and improve those outputs potentially inside your system. Finally, being able to go ahead and manage a project. So being able to go ahead and put together, let's say, a sprint on an open source project where you are the only contributor to it. There's still value in doing that because it helps you understand how to go and sequence work together and which pieces follow what dependency and how you should go ahead and get organized in order to deliver features or bug fixes relatively quickly. Very valuable skill, reduces your management overhead. Even if you're not somebody who plans on managing a team of developers, knowing how to organize your own work will make you valuable. And then finally, business risk management. So this is, in terms of if you're going to be like a solution architect or a very high level sort of developer someday. When I say high level, I mean you're working much closer to the product rather than closer to the code. And those are the developers that tend to get paid the most, in my humble opinion. Either that or the development managers. Not always true, but generally in broad strokes. If you want to get to that level, this is a thing you got to get real familiar with. So what business risk management looks like is, well, I can make this code change, but this might introduce a consistency problem that might result in customers getting double billed, which is a lot worse than, blah, blah, blah. You can go ahead and basically kind of understand how this might impact the business's customers or the suppliers or the other stakeholders in the company. And you could say, maybe we need to refactor some of these requirements because I don't think we've necessarily done our homework around making sure this is less risky for these users of the system. The people who are basically in leadership will really appreciate a developer who understands and gets this, because that is very exceptional for the most part. So the way to go ahead and get practice doing, let's say, writing and communicating is just to go ahead and start blogging, do work on some of those proof of knowledge type stuff. The way to go ahead and get and basically learn how to do project management, that type of stuff, I would say just go ahead and manage your own open source project. And the way to start reasoning about business domains and understanding business risk management is to go work for a small company. If you work for a startup or a relatively small small organization, you're going to be exposed to a lot more of this type of decision making than you are as an employee number, 100,001 at Microsoft. You're just not going to be exposed to as much of this because there's so many layers of management up above you there, and there's so much more structure to how everything works. But learning this skill is something you can bring with you to other jobs one day in the future. So it's very valuable to get some experience doing this and to be able to be comfortable having those conversations. Finally, for all this stuff, the only real way to learn is to learn by doing. So if you want to learn how to read other people's code or how to manage technical risk, best way to do that is to get involved in a more mature open source project and do it because you're either passionate about that project's mission or because you use it yourself and you want to learn how to modify it to make it do something else, or actually start using it inside maybe your own little side project. So that's my spiel on developer salaries and how to ultimately try to improve your value, try to make sure you get more offers accepted. There's some more sort of bits we could go through potentially on how to go ahead and, let's say, reduce the risk on a specific contract if you want, but I'll go ahead and save that for another stream. As I promised, some juicy open source drama. So let me go ahead and pull up my browser here. Okay, so one of the things that came across my news feed today was this blog post from Babel, a very large project in the JavaScript ecosystem. I believe it's a transpiler of sorts. Bear in mind, I do like F all in the JavaScript space, so if I get that wrong, mea culpa. But the gist behind this is that Babel, since 2018, has been conducting a funding experiment. Can full-time work on Babel be sustained? We've learned that the answer might be no. And blah, blah, blah. I'll go ahead and skip through some of that. And we'll jump down to our current funding situation. So Babel has a number of maintainers that are working mostly full-time on it. And these maintainers are basically responsible for making sure that the project is updated, that new releases come out, and that we're sort of triaging the issues that are being raised by other people who depend on this open source software. This has been part of my spiel for a long time when I talk about open source sustainability. So I'll go and pull up my website here. Let's see. I have a whole bunch of stuff. Jeez. I have to have skin in the game. There we go. How to build sustainable open source projects. So my basic thesis on making open source projects sustainable is that sustainable open source projects are sustainable businesses. Meaning that if you want your open source project to, let's say, have a contingency plan where it can go ahead and stay alive regardless of the comings and goings of individual contributors, users, maintainers, whatsoever, what you basically really need to do that is you need to build a business around it. Because that business is something that is, by definition, if it's successful, self-sustaining. So it's responsible for generating its own income and trying to go ahead and basically just generate returns based on the work that's being done in the open source. And this creates, in my opinion, a virtuous cycle where as the open source improves, more people start using it, the addressable market grows, and the potential, let's say, commercial viability of the business should also correlate with that, should improve. That's my basic thesis. I've been kind of harping on this for a couple of years. Our company, Petabridge, has been around since January 2015. We've been profitable since year one, so this is, I think we're midway through year 6 now. So we've been at this for a long time, and we've definitely experienced a lot of hard lessons along the way, but I think we're well on our way to being a really great success story in the .NET open source ecosystem. Now this brings me back to Babel. So Babel's funding situation. So every project has unique funding propositions and problems. For Babel, people often don't directly interact with it. Like most build tools, you set them up, so Babel kind of gets used behind the scenes inside other large JavaScript frameworks and so forth. So from the beginning, we knew we wouldn't have enough to pay anyone a full-time salary. So Henry has been spending a lot of time attempting to get continued funding, giving talks at conferences, and talking to companies. However, 2020 has negatively affected our funding, despite the tech industry's growth during this time. We lost some big sponsors, and Kai had to step down to get full-time work at another job. I assume Kai was one of the other maintainers. We're hoping to see a continued increase in donations to be able to increase what Yonling and Nicolo were taking. To increase what we're taking. Okay, I'm not sure I understand that part, but it didn't happen. So I believe this is the y-axis and the x-axis aren't labeled, but I'm assuming these are Open Collective, which is the platform, I think. I think that's the platform that Babel is using. And I'm not sure if this is the number of monthly donations or the total cash balance. Yeah, I don't really know what this is. This is the ongoing cash balance or not. So why don't we go ahead and actually take a look at, let's see. Let's take a look at their Open Collective here. And we can take a look at their GitHub sponsors while they're at it. All right. For now, Nicolo, Henry, and Yonling will all be paid a temporary rate of $6,000 per month. This doesn't solve the problem, but it gives us time. Well, so actually, sorry, I kind of missed the plot here. Current funding situation. So, long story short, we go up here. It's talking about some of the work they've done. Henry left his job to see if he can make a living working on open source and Babel, looking to people like Evan Yu as an example, etc., etc. After a few months, the fundraising efforts allowed paying Henry every month. We settled on $11,000 per month as a baseline salary for working full-time on open source. We had a large grant, $10,000 for 10 months, from Handshake, which initially helped boost our funds. But even when it ended, we didn't have problems paying our team, thanks to some amazing sponsors such as Airbnb, Trivago, Gatsby, AMP, and Salesforce. We didn't want to stop there. We thought by demonstrating our ability to create and pay a strong team, more features and improvements and in turn value would be delivered via Babel, which we would like to continue the momentum of by funding and sponsorship. So we started paying Yonling, Nicolo, and Kai a part-time rate of $2,000 a month. So based on my back-of-the-envelope math so far here, I'll go ahead and fire up Excel. All right, go ahead and open up a little blank workbook. So it looks like, in terms of monthly pay, we have Henry, Kai, and let me go ahead and do a little split screen here. All right, Henry, Kai, Nicolo, and go ahead and do Shuling. All right, let me go ahead and space this out. So we're at $11,000 a month. That is 2,000. Whoops. Okay. There we go. We'll go ahead and turn this into a financial column, and we'll go ahead and say total monthly burn. So one of the things you have to learn when you start a business or you're planning on raising venture capital is a financial model. And that's what we're going to try to do live here. Total monthly burn of about $17,000. Not super unreasonable for let's say a small software startup. You know, here at Petabridge, we certainly burn more than that. So let's go ahead and take a look at where Babel is today. So I haven't actually gotten to kind of what's the point of this yet. Okay, RASK. For now, Nicolo, Henry, and Juan Lang, so Kai left. $2,000 a month wasn't enough. We're going to pay all of them $6,000 a month. This doesn't solve the problem, but it gives us time while increasing the initial temporary 2,000 USD salaries. The burn rate will still be more than the donations we currently receive each month, but our balance allows us to sustain this amount to the end of 2021. Okay, so the gist of it is, for these 3 developers to be able to work more or less full-time on Babel, we need roughly $333,000 per year, which is twice what we are currently bringing in. Considering the amounts of money in the tech sector, this seems tiny in comparison. I strongly agree with that. For something that is so important to the entire open source ecosystem, it certainly seems like this is a pittance by comparison. But it would make a big difference to Babel. Let's see, RASK is for you to help fund our work via Open Collective and GitHub sponsors. Though individual contributions do matter, and we deeply appreciate them, we are really looking into more companies to step up and become sponsors. So this gets down to something that I've harped on in the past, which was I took a look at the OpenSSL and Heartbleed saga, which was this. By the donation math on this has changed quite a bit since 2014. Although, as this article that came out, and by the way, I was quoted in this, full disclosure, as this article indicates from earlier this week, looks like the donation woes at the OpenSSL Foundation are completely resolved. So why do I bring this up? OpenSSL is basically part of the backbone of most internet infrastructure. Facebook, Nginx, Amazon, and a million other giant tech companies all use it. Heartbleed was a massive bug that affected OpenSSL, which by its definition, OpenSSL is a secure socket layer. It's a way to go ahead and basically provide cryptographic transport layer security for web apps, that type of thing. So a pretty major piece of internet infrastructure. Prior to the Heartbleed bug in 2014, the OpenSSL Software Foundation received about $2,000 a year in donations, which is absolutely atrocious. So after the Heartbleed vulnerability captured the attention of the greater development community, the project managed to raise an additional $9,000. So why do I go ahead and bring this up? My opinion is so far that donations are by and large a pretty crappy way to try to create a sustainable open source project. And here's why. If I go ahead and find my donation math, all right. As you can see based on this and our previous slide, I love fake math formulas. So, Henry's salary, if I go and take a look on here, let's see. So $11,000 a month starting in. Okay, let's go ahead and say this is Henry, the main sort of maintainer for Babel. Let's go ahead and take a look at what he was paid in 2020. So $11,000 starting in January and in February. All right, so we're getting $11,000 a month. Now bear in mind, I think it mentioned in the article, or maybe in the Hacker News story, which I'm going to pull up in a second, Henry's self-employed. One of the things that absolutely sucks about self-employment in the United States is you're responsible for both halves of payroll tax, which nets out to roughly 18%. And by the way, that cost goes from your first dollar all the way up until you hit your FICA threshold, which I think is about $135,000. That number changes a little bit each year, but that rings a bell to me. I think 135 is where that tops out. So that's not a progressive tax. You're paying that from $0 all the way up to $135,000. So that's one thing that really sucks about that. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this. Looks like Henry was paid $11,000 for 11 months and then paid $9,000 for December. All right, so let me go ahead and grab a little calculator here, move this over. I have no idea what I was doing before. Let's go ahead and do 11,000 times 11. That should be 121,000 plus 9,000. All right, $130,000. So that's the salary. All right. So my donation math right here was $125,000 a year as a salaried intermediate programmer in Los Angeles. Not that far off. You start getting lots of bug reports, installations, and it begins to become a burden. You love your project, you think it becomes something great, they'll make a real difference to others if you had more time to work on it. How do you buy your own time? Well, basically, you have to go ahead and do a little math function here, which is your base salary times, I mentioned this earlier in our comp section, we call this LOD when we're doing financial modeling. These are basically all of the other liabilities that come with hiring somebody. So in the case of, let's say, I mentioned here in California, in addition to like if you're a full-time salaried software developer who's kind of intermediate, you're making $125,000 a year, let's go ahead and assume that your LOD is 40%. That includes 8.5% payroll tax for both the employee pays that. So that's actually not counted as part of what the employer pays. But if you're self-employed, you pay 17%. And then you also have to think about replacing your health care because you don't get that benefit anymore. By the way, being self-insured in the United States is not fantastic. Did that for like 5, 6 years. Do not recommend it. Hopefully we can make that better, but that'll be a stream for another day. Next, you got to go ahead and think about maybe setting aside some money for retirement. You also usually got parking, bonuses, vacation, all sorts of stuff. So your real net cost might be $175,000. So given that Henry's only paying himself $130,000 for working on the project, he might actually be underpaying himself a little bit because I believe he's based out of New York. Let's see, where was that? Well, saw it somewhere. Might have been on his Twitter, but I believe that Henry is based out of New York, which is another high cost of living place, just like California. So he's probably actually underpaying himself a little bit. Given that he has to self-insure, unless he has another full-time job in addition to this one. Since he quit in 2018, sounds like he doesn't. All right, so your hourly rate at $175,000 a year is going to be $84.13 per hour. All right, so if you want to go ahead and fund a full-time position at $84.13 an hour for 12 months, you're going to be looking at, and if you go ahead and use GitHub sponsors, let's say you're trying to do this with small donations. Let's say you try to get by with $10 per person per month. All right, so relatively small donation for a big project like Babel. In fact, let's see just how big Babel actually is. 39,000 stars on GitHub. That's like 10 times more than my project has. That's a very big, high impact project. Okay, a lot of people using it. So you would need, if I go back here, to go ahead and get to 40 hours a week at $84.13, so a normal 40-hour work week, you would need how many donors? You would need 337 $10 a month donors to cover that one person's salary. Now, to be able to go ahead and do that for roughly twice that amount, if we want to go ahead and do $333,000 a year, we're going to need in the order of about $650 to $700 to do that. So that type of math is very difficult to scale. If we go and take a look at, let's see, contributors to Babel. So how many do we have contributing to Babel right now? 158 sponsors. And let's go ahead and assume, well, they want to try to get to $12,000 a month, so they're not there yet. Let's go ahead and assume they're all paying $15 a month. Why not? Okay, so what does that math look like? Well, 15 times 158 is $2,370. Ugh. So, not going to quite get you there. This is why in Babel's post, why they're asking for corporate sponsors. It's very difficult, even for an extremely large-scale project, to support a team of developers using donation math like this, because you actually kind of need the law of large numbers working in your favor. And if you're a project with almost 40,000 stars on GitHub and you can't quite break through, what chance of success do most of the smaller projects have behind the scenes there? So that's one of the things that you're going to end up running into as a potential problem. Corporate donors are the easier way to go because you need many fewer of them, you get more bang for your buck. And that's why they're trying to go ahead and get corporate sponsorships here. Now, why would a corporation sponsor and go ahead and contribute money to Babel? Well, let's take a look at what Babel offers for some of their higher tier sponsorships on GitHub. What are the benefits? Why would you do this? Company Silver sponsor. Help support the team and you get your company logo on the front page of BabelJS.io. Gold sponsor, $1,000 a month. Help support the team and get your company logo on the front page of BabelJS. Base support tier, $2,000 a month. Help support the team with 2 hours of dedicated support a month, and you get your company logo on the front page of BabelJS. That's $14,000 a year for how many hours of support total is that? I guess that'd be 24 hours of support if you go ahead and pay all that. So that's not, in my opinion, completely crazy, as long as there's a little bit of rollover or accrual with some of those hours, but that is still kind of high. Next, company core sponsor. Support one of our core team part-time, plus more dedicated support hours, which they don't specify. And then you also get your logo on the front page of BabelJS style. Let's take a look at that. All right. So looks to me like base support, gold, silver. Okay. So who's in the base support tiers? We have some $2,000 a month takers, some $1,000 a month takers, and some $500 a month takers. What we don't have right now is we actually don't have anybody in the silver, basically anybody in the core support tiers. These are our $2,000 a month donors. So let me go ahead and count this out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So let me go ahead and grab my little calculator here. 15 times 500. So that's $7,500 a month. Plus, let's see, gold says $1,000 to $2,000 a month in the last year. Is that what gold says? Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and just split the difference, and let's go ahead and say that it is, in fact, $1,500 a month. And how many of them do we have? 4. Okay. So that'd be another $6,000. Let's go ahead and add that. 6,000. All right. That's $13,500 a month. And then we have a couple of base support sponsors. Let's say they're both donating $2,000 a month. So that'd be another $4,000 right there. So that's $17,500 a month, which should just about cover our original burn rate. Now, with Kai out of the picture, if I go and delete him, and we've reduced everyone's rate to $6,000, we're at just about break even. So based on what they've mentioned down here, is it looks like they're actually at a burn rate that is significantly higher than this. So I don't think they're pulling in quite that much money. Many of those sponsors have probably pulled out and are no longer actively supporting the project the way they used to. They do mention that in the blog post here. They just may not have updated the website yet. So let's go ahead and take a look here. Where did they mention their burn rate? That should be a little bit further up here. Large grant from Handshake. Let's see. Don't see the term burn rate on here. I saw it earlier. The burn rates will still be more than our donations we currently receive each month, but our current balance allows us to sustain the amount to the end of 2021. So if their burn rate is roughly $18,000, and if we take a look at the rest of the open collective, let's say budget here, let's see. I do not want to donate, but I do want to see the numbers. All right. So their estimated annual budget is $207,000. They've mentioned where they want to get is to $330,000. So their balance that they have today currently is about $82,000 here. Okay. So looks like what they're keeping track of here starts at $24,000 USD per year. Looks like what they're keeping track of are people who have donated, but some of these companies may no longer actively have skin in the game here. So I can take a look at some of these numbers. So Handshake, AMP, Salesforce, Frontend Matters, BitMix, Airbnb, Facebook Open Source, RunKit, Webflow, etc. So looks like you basically have your short head of big donors right here that are driving a lot of the heft behind the project. And then you end up with your kind of longer tail of smaller donors, which trails off pretty quickly once you get down there. Well, actually, no. Sorry, the way they broke this out, they have organizations versus individuals. My bad. I was looking at the wrong figures there. Okay. So here's my take on some of this. Let's take a look at our expenses. So do they have any expenses outside of, let's see. Do they have any expenses really outside of any of their, maintainers? Are they paying for, hosting or travel or anything like that? Let's see, Babel development support. This is funny. I wonder where this came from. All right. So it looks to me like their costs, domain renewal. Okay, that's pretty straightforward. looks to me like their costs are pretty fixed for the most part. So I think Babel probably actually stands a pretty reasonable chance of being able to get up to sustainability in terms of their donation math. They have a big enough project that's able to do it. Sounds like they've done okay before, but one of the things companies cut when their businesses were impacted by COVID was, donations to open source projects like this, which makes sense. But this kind of brings me back to some of my business math around this. I strongly believe that donations are inherently unsustainable. And the reason why I believe that is that you're really offering very little value in return. So, we're only at 9% towards $12,000 per month. So that means, of all these different donations that are coming in, we're donating somewhere under $1,200. That's pretty shabby for a project this big. I firmly believe that recurring donations, while well intentioned and definitely a step in the right direction, simply offer no incentive. There's no real exclusive value you get by donating that you may not be able to get by just submitting, let's say, questions on the Babel Slack or submitting issues on the Babel GitHub, repository. So you have to offer something that is exclusive and get that in exchange for value. And that's why I fundamentally believe that the way you go ahead and build a sustainable open source project is by building a sustainable business. Now we'll talk about that a bit more, but I want to get into some of the open source drama that unfolded around this post. Now, this is the infamous Red website, Hacker News, and these are the invariably toxic comments that always seem to emerge inside any sort of Hacker News front page submission. So let's go ahead and take a look. There was a Twitter thread from the original creator of Babel, Sebastian, who basically, so long story short, again, not a Babel expert, Sebastian left the project. A bunch of other people, including Henry, the lead maintainer, stepped in to go ahead and take over maintenance for it. And Sebastian went and started a venture capital funded, competing project, this little Roam Tools. I don't know if it's actually competing, but that's what they're saying. And sounds like he basically took a dump on how Henry, in particular, the lead maintainer, was basically whether or not those funds had been allocated correctly, whether or not Henry was actually delivering a sufficient amount of value in exchange for what he was doing behind the scenes. So there was a bit of a kerfluffle about the appearance of impropriety as to whether or not there was a conflict of interest for Sebastian, who just started a venture-backed competitor potentially to Babel, to go ahead and, sneer at the way the Babel project can manage its funds. I'll go ahead and set that aside. I have zero clue, and I honestly don't care about that part of it. However, as an active open source maintainer who also manages a business and a lot of other little moving parts in tandem with that, I was curious as to the veracity of whether or not Henry was doing what he was paid to do. Was he delivering a sufficient amount of value for this? So there's a whole bunch of, for lack of a better word, I'll just call it shit fighting inside the thread here. And here we go. Here we get to the nice little drama stuff here. So here's one thing I'll go ahead and comment on. The thing that they were dumping on Henry on right here is that the level of contributions on a macro scale were way lower for the highest paid guy in this project than they were for a bunch of the other maintainers who were paid a lot less. So let's go ahead and take a look at that number. So this is your insights graph that you have on a GitHub project, and you can go ahead and see Sebastian, the original creator here, very active from about looks like 2014 through the end of 2016, and then he's out, bails. Looks like Henry stepped in and shouldered a lot of the load, along with a couple of other contributors, of course, during that stretch of time as the project got popular, and basically was tasked with maintaining it for a number of years. However, let's go ahead and take a look at the commits for some of this stuff here. Actually, what I'd really like to see is a graph of some of that. Let's see. Well, I may not be able to get that. Long story short, looks to me, looking at this graph, that the amount of activity that Henry put into this repository dropped off significantly towards middle of 2018. So what happened around middle of 2018? Well, starting around, looks to be about May or June, Henry takes a full-time, basically leaves his full-time job to work full-time on Babel. And that's right around the time, let's go ahead and go back to the graph here. That's right about the time his activity as a committer dropped off. Now, as this comment wisely points out, that there's a lot of invisible activity that happens inside of the community, that commits and activity graphs don't tell the whole story. To give you an example, we just shipped Akka.NET 1.49 a couple of weeks ago, and I spent in the ballpark of like 140, 150 hours tackling one extremely nasty bug in the process there. And that's going to show up as a relatively small number of pull requests, all that work that was going into it. So, you can't necessarily point to a GitHub activity graph and have that tell the whole story. That is a fair and complete argument. However, for the sake of, let's say, completeness here, let's go ahead and take a look at my personal GitHub profile here. And let's take a look at the year 2020. Let's take a look at all my commits to Akka.NET. Now, bear in mind, in addition to committing to projects inside the Akka.NET organization, I also committed to a fair amount of Akka.NET projects that are inside the Petabridge organization too. But we're just going to look straight at Akka.NET. So I have a total of 884 contributions in the year 2020 to Akka.NET. And you can see what the rough distribution of those are. 21% of those are me reviewing other people's pull requests, 39% are me submitting my own pull requests, 5% are me participating on issue threads, 35% are my commits. Pull requests and commits are going to look roughly similar because one pull request usually equals one commit in our system. And if we take a look through some of my activity graphs here, you'll notice there's some periods of inactivity in my chart here. So for instance, the entire period of September is like a total dead zone for me. And also, by the way, most of early October. Well, why might that have been? Why might that dead zone be there? Well, I'll tell you. That dead zone is there because if I scroll down, wow, we've actually done a lot of blog posts. Nice. That dead zone is there because we launched SDK bin on September 30th and then spent the next 2 weeks or 3 weeks drumming out a ton of issues we found once people actually started using it. So that obviously ate into my time working on Akka.NET, and I wasn't able to go and contribute very much during that, let's say, month-long period there. Is what it is. All right. So shit happens. You're not necessarily able to go ahead and contribute every day, etc., etc. But, over the course of 2020, if I get rid of that filter, I did a total of nearly like 3,000 contributions here, and roughly about a third of those all went to Akka.NET. So, and you can go ahead and see that in terms of just the volume of pull requests, all the separate repositories. You can go ahead and see me engaging on issues on here. I'm also, behind the scenes setting up GitHub discussions. I'm answering questions in our Gitter chat room. I'm leading our bi-weekly team meetings that we do. I'm planning sprints and roadmaps. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. Not all of it gets captured on the GitHub activity feed. However, the point I'm trying to make is it is relatively easy to make a small amount of baseline contributions no matter how busy you get all the time on an open source project. In 2020, I got married, bought a house, launched this brand new SDK bin platform, and was also had my hands in completely redesigning Phobos, our other product, and I had a team of 2 other people I had to manage full time. Actually, 3 other people I had to manage full time. And there was a lot of stuff going on. This is also with me doing online trainings, doing basically doing customer support, doing a lot of sales work, doing a lot of consulting and architecture review. So I had stuff going on constantly. I worked like a maniac. I was able to still maintain a relatively high degree of activity. Let's take a look at our man Henry, and let's see what went into the Babel organization. I'm looking at about 240 contributions into Babel. In fact, I got curious when I took a look at some of the open collective numbers on sort of what sort of value were donors getting in exchange for their input. So I decided to go ahead and cherry pick a couple of months. So this month of November 2020, Henry made one commit to the podcast website, another commit to the podcast website, and then made one update to the Babel website here. This cost donors $11,000. In October, Henry reviewed 4 pull requests in 2 repositories and answered 1 question in 1 repository. $11,000. Henry was more active in the month of September. Created 2 commits on the website. Commented on a pull request. Overhauled the setup guide. Actually, writing documentation is pretty hard, so that probably took a lot of time. And then answered a couple of discussions. $11,000. So, speaking from personal experience, this is not a huge amount of work for someone who's being paid. Even though I think Henry's underpaying himself for living in New York, this is not a huge amount of work. And let's go ahead and take a look, by the way, because I actually just kind of vocalized this criticism on Twitter, and I caught a bit of criticism for it, which was definitely warranted. There's 2 sides to every story, and I'm just some person completely outside the Babel project. I don't know what's going on inside all of it, but I've been around the block, and this looks like resting investing to me, which is the term you use when someone's sitting there collecting their check, waiting for the equity to vest, and isn't really out there hustling for it anymore in a day. So the comment I really want to look at is there's one from one of the other active maintainers who's being paid $6,000 a year, Nicolo, I believe. Let's see. Oh, actually, here we go. We've got one from Juling. So let me go ahead and open this in a new tab. I actually haven't read that one yet, so I want to read it. The other one I want to find, where is Nicolo's? Let's see. All right. Nicolo. Okay, perfect. This is the other one I was looking for. All right. So I want to shed a little bit of context on this and the point of view of the other people who actually really have some skin in the game, who are actually working on this. So being, opinionated, internet open source guy, I think it looks like Henry's a slacker. Let's go ahead and take a look at the other people who work with him and what they think. All right, Babel maintainer here. One of the 2 contributors going from 2K a month to 6K a month. First time I write on Hacker News, I saw different comments about how Henry was getting $11K a month from our funds, but wasn't doing much for the project. So I want to share my view of the story. Be careful when you try to evaluate how much someone is working. Even if Babel is open source, almost everything we do is on GitHub, but simply looking at the main branch and counting the number of commits for each contributor does not tell the story of how so much is working. I'm paraphrasing just a little bit. One starting point would be to at least check all of the activity in the Babel GitHub organization, and you can see that I did about 700 contributions so far in 2021. Jean Lang did about 500. Henry did about 160. The number of commits does not reflect the number of contributions. Firmly agree with that. Because the writing code, reviewing pull requests, issue triage tasks are not equally distributed across the team. For example, I prefer reviewing while others prefer coding. However, even according to these stats, Henry is doing less than the other 2 paid maintainers. Again, we cannot just use GitHub stats to measure how much we do. If you're considering sponsoring us and want to know what we did or what we'll do, we have a Things We Did page and a roadmap. But feel free to reach out directly to us and ask what we're working on or what we plan to do. Henry is the one who contacts the companies, trying to explain to them why they should support us. The one who gives the most talks at their internal events. He's the one working on fundraising for the team. Even without him, many companies would probably donate, but I don't think we would have ever reached the current levels that enabled us to pay a small team. So what Nicolo's explaining here is Henry basically works on a non-profit organization, which we call development. This is the process of essentially establishing relationships with donors, trying to secure commitments, and using that to go ahead and meet your funding goals. So this is what sort of non-profit fundraising often looks like. All right, I'll continue. That said, there was a big problem that no one on the team was talking about. Whilst we all knew that Henry was, quote, not doing nothing, I felt that I deserved more than just 1/5 or more than 1/4 since Henry decreased what he was taking of Henry's salary. What I wasn't doing wasn't less valuable than what Henry was doing, When some people reached out to me about it, I realized that this feeling was shared by other people in the open source community. I thus decided to talk with the team about it. It was hard for me to do because I consider everyone on the team a friend, and it's hard to tell a friend you should earn less because I want to earn more. However, everyone on the team was receptive to my arguments, and everyone agreed that we should have reassessed our salaries. The main reason that Henry was earning more was that he was originally the only paid contributor, and when the remainder of us wanted to be paid, we just divided the remaining incoming money. We've rebalanced how funds are distributed, and we will keep communicating between us how we divide the funds, that no one on the team here feels like there's some kind of injustice in the future. When we settled on $6K a month, I was asked by a team member, do you think this is the right amount of money for you, or you still might not be happy about it in the future? I can't speak for the future for me, but now I don't think I need, deserve, or want to earn more from the other team members. If we get enough money to pay blah, blah, blah. All right. Also, to address the other things, let's see. Okay. If it helps put things in perspective, this isn't a side project for any of the paid maintainers. We don't work 40 hours a week, but we still dedicate a big amount of time to the project. I can only speak for me, but 12 hours classes, dedicate about 20 to 30 hours a week per Babel. It's not always the same, sometimes less, sometimes more. Blah, 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 blah. Company hires you $6K gross, actual cost of the company is more. Since we're self-employed, this is what I was talking about with the overhead in terms of insurance and payroll taxes and all that. So, Henry is being paid $11,000 a month for less than 40 hours of work is one of my takeaways from this. And here's the other thing. So, going out and basically establishing relationships, giving conference talks, trying to go ahead and build these relationships with donors in order to fund the project. I understand how difficult that is. We have to go ahead and I have to spend quite a bit of time doing sales as one of the things we work on, where I have to spend many hours each week interacting with customers, doing discovery calls, putting together proposals. We have a whole nother dedicated person on our team whose sole responsibility is managing all the process of papering, all that stuff, managing our deal pipeline, and all that type of thing. There is a lot of work that goes into it. So I understand. I used to do all of it myself, so I understand the overhead behind that. That being said, I am deeply skeptical about whether the donors are getting the bang for their buck based on this. I think Niccolo explained things very honestly and candidly and did a really good job making the case that Henry's doing his best and he's made big contributions to the project. But in so doing, I feel like, you know what? If your problem is that the person who's supposed to be raising funds for you hasn't been able to do that and has still been paying himself quite a bit of money while also not contributing to what the users really want, which is the users don't want sustainable development salaries for Babel's developers. They want Babel to be maintained and updated. And, if Henry's spending all his time doing that, not successfully raising money, and not contributing to the project either, that's a misallocation of funds. And, that might be unpleasant and difficult to hear, but it's just the truth. Now, I want to see what the other contributor, Zhongling, had to say. Okay. I would like to share my perspective here. GitHub is a platform where people collaborate on developing software. So the contribution graph is engineering biased. Agree. That's my interjection there. But operating an open source organization, especially like Babel, which is serving millions of users, is just like running a company. In a company, we have different roles. I'm actually going to circle back on this because I was going to make the argument on Twitter, but I'll make it here. In a company, we have different roles, and no role is more important than the others. In the Babel team, Henry spends most of his time reaching out to contacts and companies, giving talks, syncing with different projects in the ecosystem, offering mentorship to junior contributors like me. None of these are visible in GitHub. They are vital to sustain the project, to attract both new company sponsors and contributors. 2020 is a hard time for many reasons. Before we talk about funding with the team, Henry has already voluntarily pooled us money, and another longtime contributor, Brian, has stopped taking money altogether. While this helped bump up our balance, everyone taking less is a dangerous signal to open source. Maintainers constantly fighting with financial insecurity may burn out or stop maintaining in order to recover from the mental pressure of I am responsible for this. I've maintained small side projects where the feature set is frozen and most maintenance can be automated by bots. This is quite unlike Babel. The feature is open-ended because the language is evolving. Various edge cases should be taken care of. Trade-offs between spec compliance and output code size should be made. It is not a side project that I can dedicate part-time efforts like 10 hours a week to work on. Speaking for myself, I spend around 40 hours a week to meet my own productivity requirements. I don't think I deserve more than other paid team members because everyone has different time constraints, and we don't track work time meticulously. I do, which is why my little tracker's up here. To avoid burnout and not let Babel consume all my energy, I spare some time on encoding Chinese characters in Unicode, which, just like Babel, has profound impacts on ecosystem, but long overlooked and underfunded. I am submitting hundreds of characters on in IRGN 2487. Okay. So my take is the other contributors who are also receiving money from Babel's donors both feel like it was a good thing that they reallocated the split, but that this ultimately isn't good in terms of a health signal that it sends to the Babel ecosystem that they're having these financial insecurity issues. I wholeheartedly agree with that. But they also point out that, Henry has spent a lot of time reaching out to companies, giving talks, and trying to bring people in. So he mentions in his post here that this is like running a business. So I'll go ahead and give you a business analogy. This is like having a CEO who takes excessive executive compensation and hasn't been able to bring in the right people or resources to make the business sustainable. And what you're seeing kind of in the comments from skeptical users, like there's actually some angry donors and other stuff like that inside the main thread here. I'll go ahead and dig through and try to find them. But this is like a shareholder revolt in essence, where they're saying, look, we've spent a lot of money and where has it gone? For a project to receive, in the ballpark of, I go and pull up their data here. How much have they completely raised so far? Let's see if the about section. Here we go. Total raised nearly $700,000. That completely dwarfs most other open source projects in the ecosystem. Yet they've disbursed $600,000 of it, and they have an estimated annual budget of $208,000 right now. Now, I understand how expensive it is to go ahead and maintain. How expensive it is to go ahead and maintain a complex open source project. Babel has an even bigger surface area than something like Akadana does, right? But every project's different in terms of where its different development constraints and costs are downstream. But I understand, empathize with that. That being said, this looks to me like a fairly ineffective use of capital. The level of effort that someone puts into their project should ultimately be, if this is their full-time job, it should look like a lot more than 40 hours a week if they're self-employed. If you're going to go ahead and, let's say, collect, a fairly generous monthly salary, it's generous in the sense on just the pure abstract, but adjusting it for cost living in New York, I actually think Henry might be underpaying himself, particularly for someone who's working in such a complex tooling ecosystem like Babel. That being said, Henry doesn't seem to be showing up all that much in the commits. And in terms of some of the other activity that's on there, I do buy the argument that there's a lot of activity that isn't reflected on there, but come on. This is pretty, this tells a story of significant inactivity. Again, not to toot my own horn here. If I go and pull up, let's say, just the main Akadana project on its own, and I go to Insights here, let's see, whoops, wrong one. Insights. And I go ahead and I take a look at contributors. Okay, so I've done, ballpark 1,100 commits. By the way, we squash all of our commits. So one pull request typically equals one commit. We didn't do that back in the early days, but since we kind of standardize on it, that's what we've been doing for the better part of, 6-7 years. So I've got a pretty steady contribution graph all the way through here. And this includes times where I get really busy and when I've got other things I got to work on, other competing priorities, because life happens. You can't be on all the time. That's as true in a business environment as it is in an open source environment like this. But Having, let's say, over the course of 1 year, 240 incidents of activity, a lot of which don't appear to be all that complicated either, like doing, looks good to me, pull request reviews, stuff like that. That's pretty shabby. Even if you're someone who's out fundraising and doing all that work, you can make more time to basically be an active presence inside the project. I understand why his fellow contributors are defending him. They've got skin in the game. They have a reason to go ahead and support him because he probably has been effective in bringing in some donations. But if they come out and badmouth him and say, yeah, Henry, hasn't been spending this money properly, they're going to scare everybody else off. So there's an incentive to go ahead and essentially, come together and hold the line and present a unified front to the donor community. So while I agree that Babel should be financially sustainable given how important it is in the overall open source ecosystem, it certainly smells to me like there's been a misallocation of funds. I'd be very hard pressed to be convinced otherwise. I'm not very sympathetic to the argument that raising money and working with donors and giving talks takes a huge amount of time. I do that shit all the time myself. In fact, if I go ahead and take a look at my graph in terms of what I've done like just this week, let's see if I can go ahead and pull up myself again here. Let's open this up. All right. I think this week I've mostly just, created 53 commits and 17 repositories. Okay, I did a lot of work last week. This week, I think I've primarily done some work on our blog, reviewed a couple pull requests on the Redis side of things, and worked on some blog posts, some stuff like that. And basically did a couple reviews, filed some issues. I haven't done a huge amount of coding this week because yesterday I spent 4.5 hours supporting customers, another 5 hours doing training, another 3 or 4 hours doing some management, marketing, and sort of administrative type stuff. Today, spent about another 4 or 5 hours doing training, another 4 or 5 hours doing some marketing, and then I'm finally going to get into a little bit more code and management type stuff, maybe a little bit earlier tomorrow, and then I've got a whole bunch of other non-technical stuff I have to do. But I can still make time to show up and review pull requests and make sure stuff gets merged in. So I don't really buy the argument that this is some impossible burden to ask somebody who's being paid a relatively large share of the total donations of this project to do this full time. So I think that the Babel project's got a little bit of work to do to reassure people that their donations aren't being wasted. In fact, I wanted to go ahead and see if I could find that comment from earlier. Let's see. Let's go ahead and pull up the comments here. Wow, the comments keep piling in here. Let's see, where was that comment? Well, can't remember where I stuck that anymore. I think I tweeted it out earlier. Well, I won't go ahead and bother with that right now. But this whole thread is interesting. I'll go ahead and drop it. Well, interesting, but still relatively toxic for Hacker News. I'll go ahead and drop a link to that in chat. Now, what I want to go ahead and spend the last, 15 minutes or so we have working on today is talking about what I would do if I were in Babel's situation. I think everyone in the Babel project has good intentions. I just don't think that the results of the level of effort on driving in those donations has been there. And here's one thing I'm going to go ahead and say, sort of squarely at open source developers, you're the reason why most of your projects are not sustainable. It's because you haven't put in the effort to create the incentives that people who would want to pay will actually follow through on. I think donations, by and large, are hopelessly fucked as a way to try to go ahead and fund an open source project. And, I haven't even entertained the idea of seriously doing that for Akka.net or for any of my other open source projects because I don't know what I would offer on my, my donation on a GitHub sponsorship level. I would much rather have my, customers buy support plans or buy a Phobos license or something else because that's a automatic recurring contract. We deliver exclusive value to those users. They get patch priority, and there's a lot of benefits to doing that. And that's where these different sort of open source business models kind of come into play here. I think the easiest way to go ahead and actually make a project like Babel sustainable is to go ahead and offer something that is exclusive to paying customers. So Best way of doing that, in my opinion, when I say best, I mean like requires the least amount of product development overhead, is the services model. To go ahead and actually sell training, consulting, and support directly to the users of your software. So this, of course, requires developing and delivering courses, and then doing that somewhat regularly requires you building a platform to sell it, blah, blah, blah. There's costs associated with that, and you actually also have to enjoy doing that stuff. If you don't enjoy doing that, maybe that model is not for you. So the next sort of area this brings us to is the open core model. Bringing something premium and proprietary around your open source that's valuable to customers with deep pockets. So in our business, this is application performance monitoring. That's our sort of open core stuff that we sell. For something like Babel, I have zero clue what they could possibly offer there. Don't know enough about the ecosystem. Don't have enough to give any sort of halfway reasonable recommendation there on what they'd want to do. Licensing model. Introduce a copyleft license for the open source and a dual proprietary license for companies who want to use the technology commercially. This would be an absolutely terrible idea for Babel. It would destroy the virality of their library. Babel is used inside a bunch of other open source technologies. That's why they're so heavily adopted. So if they did this, this would have a viral impact and would go ahead and blow up their entire install base. Would definitely not recommend doing that. Managed services model. Build some managed services top of your open source you can sell directly as a pass-style product. Honestly, probably not applicable for Babel. It's a build tool by the sound of it. Probably wouldn't work. Reputation model, try to get hired. This is the exact opposite of what the Babel developers want to do. They do not want to be in the business of going back to work full-time for Amazon or somebody. That's not what they're about. So this leads me to conclude there's actually a sixth option that I never included on here because I did not think of it. Someone else did. And I think it was one of the developers behind Laravel or one of the other major PHP frameworks that came up with this. And this is the idea of crowdfunding using something like GitHub sponsorships or Open Collective. The idea being the core development team puts together a special new release of their software and only makes it available to paying customers until they reach a certain payment threshold. And that payment threshold might be their $12,000 a month target on GitHub. So they go ahead and wait until they hit that target, and then they release it open source for free to everybody. And they can go ahead and repeat that over and over again. That sort of model is only something you can do with a fairly substantial install base. Now, the one problem with Babel kind of pursuing that model is if the way most of Babel sort of gets used is inside other open source frameworks, there's no easy way necessarily of controlling that. As soon as, let's say, Babel gets released to one of the frameworks that donates some money back to it, they might go ahead and incorporate that new build tool into their system, and then all the value kind of gets extracted somewhere else. But that's something. But again, that's not something that's not something I don't know quite enough about Babel to go ahead and give a more firm recommendation there. But that approach would align much more closely with their model they have now than trying to pursue something like a services model or or maybe an open core model. But I still think that it might be useful for them to go ahead and maybe engage in a services model or something else. There could be some value in that. So, for instance, they offer these support tiers, which someone's buying, but they don't have that many takers. Well, I would go ahead and drive up the number of hours. I would basically make the commitment bigger, and I would go ahead and do my best to try to make sure that these. When I say make the commitment bigger, I mean that Babel should make a bigger commitment potentially to their customers. So maybe go ahead and offer, rather than 2 hours a month for $2,000, that's $1,000 an hour. That's kind of steep. I would go ahead and maybe offer, let's say, for $2,000 a year, somewhere in that ballpark. Maybe we'll go ahead and offer 8 hours of support. Do something like that. That's kind of similar to some of the pricing models we do around our Octodon support plans. And we found that kind of helping scale those up and down to the size of the customer can actually make a pretty big difference in terms of whether or not you actually get the deal or not. So I would probably spend some time taking a look at what sort of companies are filing issues, what are they reporting, and who are the companies that would actually want to have, let's say, full-time support around something like Babel. And I'd go ahead and actually do a real market projection of how many companies of that size do we think there are. This is something we did in-house at Phobos with our, which is our technology here. In fact, I have some mathematics. I love donation math, or say open source business math. I have some data around this here. So this is our SDK bin sort of February update, where we talked a bit about our sales success around actually going and delivering products to our customers via our automated marketplace that we've been building. This is one of the solutions, by the way, we're trying to put into market to make it easier for companies to go ahead and actually start selling open source, let's say services like support or training, or actual products that are open core like Phobos directly to customers. So one of the things I mentioned is that, so we completely overhauled Phobos in the middle of 2020. We launched it originally in August 2018. So Phobos was originally priced as a per core product. So the average license cost for Phobos was in the ballpark of $10,000 to $15,000 when we first launched it in 2018. And we had a fairly small number of customers at that price point. Now, the reason why actually had nothing to do with the price. It had to do with the fact that it was really complicated for procurement departments to figure out how much things would cost under that model. And if there's anything procurement departments don't like, it's variability inside their budget. They like flat numbers that don't change, that are easy to factor into recurring budgets. So that's why annualized licenses would work, but variable, like per consumption licenses, are a much tougher pill to swallow unless you're a large platform like Azure or Amazon or something like that. So here's what we tried going with. We decided to go ahead and reduce our price on Phobos from our variable per core licensing, which I said averaged to about, let's say, $10,000 to $15,000 a year. And we only had a relatively small number of customers for that. We went ahead and reset the price to a flat $4,000 per year. And we said, basically, this price will be the same per organization. So if Microsoft buys one license, they can go ahead and use it in all their products they use Aki.net for $4,000 a year. So we might be giving up a whole bunch of value in the course of doing that. The reason why we tried to have that utilization pricing model was to make more money from bigger customers, less from smaller customers. But scaling around the number of cores actually was a pretty poor measure for doing that. So we decided to throw that entire model in the trash and just switch to flat organizational pricing. Well, doing that significantly improved our conversions. Now, I say here we've been selling 50% more Phobos licenses per month. Actually, sorry, that's since we launched SDK bin, my bad. Since we changed our pricing, we've increased the number of licenses we sold or renewed per year by an order of magnitude. And that's because the actual pricing model was relatively simple, easy for procurement departments to swallow, and in a lot of cases, this $4,000 a year number fits underneath the procurement budgets for a lot of software development teams. So you don't necessarily have to go through a giant authorization to do some of that. Although, as our head of sales can tell you, we still have to do quite a bit of procurement dance in order to get this sold with most of our customers. Although there's also a large number of them that show up and swipe a credit card without ever talking to us first, which is what Phobos helped us do. Not Phobos, which is what SDK bin helped us do. SDK bin really helped us go ahead and scale from doing, let's say, I don't know, we'll go ahead and say, doing a small but steady trickle of Phobos sales to getting really consistent volume month over month out of that. And the best part is SDK bin will go ahead and automatically manage our renewals for us, which helps us compound our revenue. And so year over year growth will go ahead and scale quite nicely from that. This is one of the things I really think that the Babel project should consider doing. No, not necessarily using SDK bin. We don't support NPM packages, and we don't support third-party publishers yet, but that will change hopefully over the next year or so. What they should take a look at is offering these services that have recurring value, whether it's in the form of open core products or in the form of, let's say, support plans that are fulfilled through open collective sponsorships, and try to go ahead and make sure customers are using their support plans. So that actually requires you to get like a CRM, where you can go ahead, CRM is short for Customer Relationship Management System. You have to go ahead and actually keep track of where people are in the deal process. You need to go ahead and basically know which customers need to be contacted. If a customer is not using their support plan, they are going to cancel eventually. So you want to make sure the utilization of that plan is high. You also might want to start offering some paid training. That might be something else you might be able to sell as well. I think Babel will ultimately be much more successful rather than trying to appeal to their own importance within the JavaScript ecosystem and make an argument that it looks really bad for open source if this project fails. That's a pretty weak argument, and in fact, making that argument actually weakens their position. They should go ahead and come out and try to go ahead and generate some income by selling things people want. This is, capitalism, right? This is a tale as old as time. If they do that, and particularly if they can find a way of providing recurring, consistent, let's say, value to customers, you can go ahead and get that compound growth from having support plans renew year over year, or having training subscriptions compound year over year. Yes, that is somewhat of an exercise that will consume an inordinate amount of time that could otherwise be spent on working on the actual Babel technology itself. But if this is what Henry's supposedly spending his time doing, you know, maybe 40 hours a week, um, according to Niccolo, then that would be a good way for him to go ahead and try to help sustain the financial viability of the organization. Create a company around Babel. Try to go ahead and get the other employees on board as either independent contractors, which they basically are today anyway, or try to get them on board as full salaried members. Maybe we can start solving some of the healthcare and sales tax and payroll tax problems that way. Make it sort of a company burden rather than an individual burden. And then go ahead and try to really focus on building some compound growth by generating renewals and subscriptions year over year. So anyway, that'll go ahead and do it for our stream tonight. I hope you've enjoyed walking through obviously increasing developer salaries and talking a little bit about open source monetization and about this BabelJS issue. If you have any questions, please go ahead and drop us a line on Twitter. So I'm actually Aaron on the web on Twitter. You can see the link in my Twitch profile. And make sure you go ahead and follow us and catch us next Thursday for .NET and Scotch. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good night.